All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Platypus affiliate, sorry. Welcome to Marco Strydom's public interview. Being hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Society. So, the Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s and 70s, and post-political 80s and 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. Today, we will be hosting an interview with Marco Strydom. Marco Strydom is a history graduate from Witwatersrand University, interested in world system theory and Communist Party state. We'll be okay, and give me 1 second because I know I had more written up here. In this interview, we'll be discussing the history and legacy of Nikolai Bukharin and the NEP, Deng Xiaoping, and post-reform China, and their relevance in the 21st century left regarding the struggle for socialism. Sorry, I had much more. I guess, Marco, do you want to do a little round of introduction for yourself before I go any further?
No, I think that's covers it.
Alrighty, well, thank you. So I guess we'll just jump right into the questioning, or I guess jump right into the interview. So, all right, give me 1 second to pull this up. All right, so the first question, I want to ask you, Marco, is when and how did you become politicized? What was it that made you call yourself a communist? Or if you want to consider yourself, a communist, how would you label yourself?
In 2017, it was the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, and we were covering it in our school. And it was a major part of our syllabus. And our teacher was reading to us from the textbook about the Russian Revolution. And at one point, she just closed it and she said, "I'm not going to bother. You guys should just read Lenin and you should read Marx." So that's what I did. And as I read it, I came to understand the world system that we live in and the great tumult of the 20th century. And I came to identify myself as a communist. In other words, my ultimate aim would be a classless, moneyless, stateless society. But I understand that to be a very long-term project.
Yeah, this kind of leads to my second question, which is how would you describe your task and aim? And by that specifically, I mean, who do you think you are in relation to the left? Like, what is your political project, and why do you see it as necessary today?
Well, I don't necessarily identify myself with the left or the right, as I don't like tribalism. And above all, I would say that I am a circumstantialist. So I judge everything case by case rather than having a prefigured set of values that I then apply to the situation. I think we need to be more pragmatic rather than ideological. I would say that generally speaking, my sympathies would be more left-leaning, but I would still be hesitant to call myself someone who is on the left.
Okay, interesting. Well, I guess let me ask, in regards to that, like, have you ever flirted around with any communist organizations or even like left organizations? If even if you may not consider yourself, like left per se, right? Like, have you ever flirted around with any left organizations, communist organizations, socialist organizations, or public figures or public or media outlets? Do you find any organizational or concrete expressions for your views, or would you say that your perspective is kind of unique?
I think I am rather idiosyncratic, and I rather like that. I've never been a member of any particular left-leaning organization, although there were a few of them on campus. I didn't really find any one of them to really fit my way of seeing things. So I know a lot of people in leftist organizations, and I talk to them, and I do talks at leftist organizations, but I'm not really a member of any of them.
Yeah, if you don't mind me asking, like, what left organizations have you, I guess, like flirted around with, or like, I guess, been in contact with?
Well, the one that I've known the most, just because they're active in like my immediate vicinity, were the WASPs. They were kind of Trotskyists, but also not. And they kind of broke up into different factions. And, the rest is history.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because I guess if you don't mind me asking, like, could you say a little bit about the left in South Africa, or like, what's going on in the left in South Africa that, in some sense, I guess, got you or maybe not even if you want to call them the left, what's going on with the communists in South Africa in the present that in some sense, I guess, yeah, I guess got you interest or not interesting. I guess, got you more engaged in kind of, what's going on in the world today.
Well, in South Africa, apartheid only ended about 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So the fallout from that is still with us. And on the left, there's a general idea that there was an unfinished revolution, that apartheid was ended legislatively. But a lot of the inequalities of the apartheid era have remained with us, especially in terms of land ownership. White families still monopolize most of the arable land, and so on and so forth. So there's this idea that the ANC, who is the ruling party in South Africa, turned its back on a lot of its left-wing rhetoric when it came to power, and it's very much become the party of the black bourgeoisie. And it's interesting because in South Africa, we have a communist party, and it's existed since 1921. But the South African Communist Party, SACP, unfortunately has very much tied itself to the ANC, has done since the apartheid era and afterwards. So every other year, they'll criticize the ANC for not being left-wing enough or for making concessions to the right and so on and so forth, but they won't actually split with them, no matter what the ANC actually does. That led to a lot of people who are on the left moving away from the ANC and the Communist Party and going towards the EFF, or Economic Freedom Fighters. But they're more ethno-nationalist than anything else. If you read, for example, what they often argue for fighting against white monopoly capital and so on and so forth. They don't really talk about capitalism as such, specifically the white section of it. So the left in South Africa is facing the same sort of impasse that the left really faces across Southern Africa. At the end of the 20th century, a lot of the settler colonial regimes in Angola, Mozambique, Rhodesia, what is now Namibia, and South Africa collapsed. And what were up until then populist leftist movements came to power. But after coming to power, they basically decided not to push through their leftist program, and they settled on a sort of capitalist system where they became the comprador group, facilitating foreign capital's exploitation of their own countries. So that's the impasse the left faces itself now. And it's also a matter of timing because the Soviet Union and the people's democracies collapsed around about the same time. So there was a sort of lack of belief in left-wing values when these groups came to power. The MPLA in Angola and FNLA in Mozambique and Mugabe in what was Rhodesia, what is now Zimbabwe, and the ANC in South Africa.
Okay, fascinating. We'll have to visit that later. Okay. If you were to perform a political autopsy on yourself, what would the results be? And in other words, what I'm asking is, how does an individual such as yourself come into existence? How does a young person in 2025 come to identify with, like, say, for example, the CCP? How does one come to grow an affinity with Nikolai Bukharin? How does one grow an affinity with Deng Xiaoping today?
Well, you have to ask yourself, why did the Soviet Union disappear in 1991, but the People's Republic of China is still here? Evidently, they've done something right if they've lasted longer. In the Soviet Union, there was a lot of good there that should be emulated. I mean, for example, the Soviet Union turned a backward country into a modern country. They defeated Nazism. They aided anti-colonial movements all around the world. And they created a welfare state that covered 300 million people, which is not something to scoff or sneeze at. But at the same time, the Soviet system proved unsustainable and ultimately imploded because a right-wing clique formed within the Communist Party Soviet Union, and they were able to disband the country. And the left wing of the party was unable to actually mobilize the masses to prevent this from happening. Whereas in China, there has been a reform process, the likes of which is comparable to what the Soviet Union did, especially in the 1920s, but also in the 60s and the early 70s. However, the difference is that the Chinese system has proven to be far more flexible than the Soviet system proved to be. And the Chinese Communist Party proved to be far more stable than the Communist Party Soviet Union was. So I would say that the reason I'm so interested in China is because they have a model which is durable and which has actually worked well to improve people's lives.
Okay. And so this might be a recurring question, or this is a question that will be hinted at throughout the entire interview, but I'll ask it most concretely here, which is what comments, discontents, and critiques do you have of the left end of communism today, on the left end of communism historically? Generally, would you frame the legacy of communism and the left broadly in a positive or a negative light?
Well, I would start by saying that in the countries where communist parties came to power, you saw a rise in the standard of living of hundreds of millions of people, faster than anything which had ever come before or anything which ever came afterwards. So again, that's not something to simply dismiss as economistic. That is something that is actually worthwhile. That said, I would also point out that you have to ask the question, why did communism only come to power in a few countries? Now, granted, Russia and China are important countries, but Poland, less so, Cuba, less so, North Korea, less so, And why is it that communism failed to spread into Southern Africa, as it was seeming in the 70s was going to happen? Why did communism not spread into Latin America, as it seemed would happen in the 60s and 70s? And I think you have to ask at what point the capitalist system on a world scale, which is defined by Western imperialism in the main, proved to be far more durable than classical Marxist theory believed it to be. So that is why, until imperialism is defeated at a world scale, you will invariably see communist party states slipping back into some form of the mixed economy, because it's unsustainable to have full socialization of property in an isolated country, and also to develop your people's standard of living. You need foreign investment, you need transfers of technology and science.
Okay. And I guess this now leads me to a series of questions regarding, I guess, if I may call it your Bukharinism and your Dengism, if you don't mind. So to begin with, can you speak a little bit about Bukharin, specifically why Bukharin? Like, what relevance does Bukharin have on the left historically and today? How is a return to Bukharin ultimately in the service of the struggle for socialism?
There used to be a debate in China, as there was in the Soviet Union at an earlier point, about the red and expert. In other words, when a revolution happens, how do you keep things running? Because a lot of the experts will belong to the upper classes. So you need to find a way to incorporate them into the revolutionary regime if it is to stabilize itself. Now, Bukharin is interesting because his parents were both school teachers, and he developed a love for reading from a very early age. And his father was an atheist, which was quite unusual for that time and place, and it left a lasting impression on him. Bukharin actually studied economics at Moscow Imperial University, making him the only one of the big Bolsheviks to actually have studied economics at the university, which is why he should have been, people should have paid more attention to him. And the reason why he's so important is that he was not the only, but certainly one of the intellectual inspirations behind reform and opening up in China from 1978 up until the present day. Basically, you create a mixed economy so that you can draw the benefits of being a part of the world market, which was still dominated by the West at that point. But nevertheless, you have a state that's strong enough to prevent that Western influence from completely dominating your country. Most countries in the world are very poor and their governments are very weak, and these countries are actually run by multinational corporations, a lot of which are based in the West. Not so much anymore, but 60s, 70s, very much so. But Bukharin is interesting because there are two turning points in the history of the Communist Party state and the world system. And that's 1978, which is when reform and opening up began in China. Deng Xiaoping is always seen as the figurehead in China, but also in the West. But he was really only the head of a team. There were a bunch of guys and a brain trust behind Deng. The actual pronunciation is Dong. And Chenyun was one of them, and he's the Chinese Bukharin. And he advocated much the same sort of ideas that Bukharin did, because, again, the Chinese were faced with an objective situation, irrespective of how one chooses to interpret it, which is, again, like the Soviet Union in the 1920s. The People's Republic of China in the 1970s was isolated internationally, and that retarded its development. It needed to find some way to reincorporate itself into the world economy. Now, the reason the new economic policy was not as successful as reform and opening up at doing that is because the Soviet Union was much more isolated even after it had tried to open itself to the outside world. I mean, Lenin was calling for American capital to be invested in the Soviet Union. And, very little of it was forthcoming compared to what he actually wanted. Whereas under Deng Xiaoping, China became the world's main export economy.
Okay, fascinating. So then I guess I have to ask you, what do you make of both Stalin and Trotsky? Who is Bukharin in relation to them, and what does Bukharinism have to offer as an alternative to both Trotskyism and Stalinism?
Well, I wouldn't say Bukharinism was a distinct ideology, because before the Russian Revolution, Bukharin would have identified himself as a communist or a Marxist. And he would have continued to use those labels into his later life. But by the end of his life, he also called himself a Leninist, which he didn't do before the Russian Revolution. Bukharin was Stalin's ally during the new economic policy period, just after the death of Lenin. And Isaac Deutscher, for example, is a Trotskyist author, calls Bukharin the co-author of Socialism in One Country. It's correct to the extent that Bukharin did believe you could begin to build socialism in an isolated workers' state. But it's wrong in the sense that Bukharin never gave up hope that the revolution would eventually spread to other countries. So he wasn't a complete believer in autarky, the way he's sometimes framed as being. Quite the opposite. It's interesting because there was an opportunity for Trotsky to form some kind of alliance with Bukharin during the power struggle with Stalin. But Trotsky advanced the slogan that with Stalin against Bukharin, yes. With Bukharin against Stalin, never. So, yeah.
That's really fascinating. So, okay, so I guess if Bukharinism is not, or in some sense, if Bukharinism was never in some sense, a really defined ideology, I guess, I guess this kind of leads me to my next question, which is, so in 1918, Lenin called Bukharin a left communist regarding his position on the question of peace with Germany. In 1924, Trotsky claimed that Bukharin was on the right of Stalin. So what does it mean to say that there's a left and right in communism historically? How useful are these categories today?
I think they're still useful today. In the context of Soviet history, Bukharin was a left communist during the revolution itself, when he advocated for the Red Army to not only continue fighting Germany, but to actually conquer Germany and export the revolution there. Because Bukharin did not believe that the German working class could make a revolution on their own, which, again, he was proven right on. However, Lenin was right to oppose him on that question, because Russia simply could not fight a war against the Germans at that time. So you could say that Bukharin was more revolutionary than Lenin at that point in his life, but he was so revolutionary that his ideals were unrealizable. During the new economic policy, it was quite the opposite, because the revolution had been quite the sobering experience for him, and he saw the limitations of the old theorems that he had grown up with, especially those of classical Marxism. And he began to try and take classical Marxism's methodology, but apply a more practical bent to it. And that's why he advocated the sort of mixed economy. And he didn't need to read Hegel and Aristotle to value experimentalism, to understand that you can't just one day socialize the entire economy and then the next day expect everything to be running well. Like, you need to do things carefully and calculated. I think it's still relevant because a lot of people who call themselves communists are so revolutionary that their ideals are unrealizable. And when they see someone like Bukharin or Deng Xiaoping, they'll condemn them and say, but they're not living up to the ideals of what they consider to be the left or communism. and they'll ignore that life objectively got better for people because that's less important to them than the ideal of a revolution.
Okay, fascinating. So I'm curious, are you familiar with Jay Lovestone? He was an American Bukharinist in the Communist Party during the 1920s and 30s who led the expulsion of James Buchanan and his followers for their Trotskyism, only for Lovestone and his followers to be themselves be expelled by the Comintern for their support of Bukharin and the right opposition. Lovestone would later form the Communist Party opposition, not really a creative name, but the CPO, and thought that because of America's social and economic uniqueness and increasing strength of the nation's capitalism, a revolution was not imminent in the country. Thus, communists in America needed to do a strategy unique to their conditions and not follow the party line fashioned by the Soviet communists, as it failed to appreciate that capitalism did not follow the same pattern of development in every country. Stalin derided these views as American exceptionalism and accused the Lovestonites of believing that America is independent of the Marxist laws of history. But I'm curious as to what you make of Lovestone and his approach to what is to be done in the United States. Do you think Lovestone was faithful to Bukharin? If not, what do you postulate a Bukharinist party in America during that period should have done and why? And I guess it's more broadly, what would have been, or what would a communist party that is Bukharinist or not, what sort of policies would they pursue, or has the communist or have communist parties been Bukharinist?
Well, Stalin was quite mechanistic in his thinking on these questions. For example, he falls back on this idea of the laws of history in his other writings as well. And he often does not draw a distinction between a tendency and a law, which is quite a fundamental distinction that needs to be made. But in this case, Stalin believed that there was only one form of socialism, Marxism-Leninism, and that it was universally applicable. Now, it's interesting because Stalin also chastised the Chinese socialists, because the Chinese socialists had the motto, socialism with Chinese characteristics, which most people don't know comes from the 1920s, because the Chinese were trying to work out how can they apply this European-derived theorem, Marxism, to Chinese conditions. And Stalin derided that and said, there's only one socialism, Marxism, Leninism. And he said the same thing to the Americans. But the fact is, socialism will look differently depending on the country where it's being implemented. It will never be exactly the same in every country, even if there are general features which will be common to different socialist states. I think that in the United States, as far as a party political program is concerned, advocating a mixed economy is much more realistic than advocating the full socialization of property. But I think that the important thing that the Lovestonites at least tried to do was to create a party which had the support of the majority of working class people. And they didn't succeed in doing that. But if a program, the likes of which I've described, is to actually be pushed in the United States, the two-party system will have to be broken, because you have two parties, but they're both the representatives of different sections of the bourgeoisie. There needs to be an independent party of the working class, which has the majority of its support.
Throughout our conversations, I've gotten the sense that you see a red thread of history among Bukharin, Deng, or Bukharin, Deng, and Ji. If I'm not mistaken in this impression, then can you expound upon the relationship of these three? How does each subsequent leader draw upon their precedent in affirmation or critique, consciously or unconsciously? What binds these three figures together in connecting the struggle of socialism in the 20th century to the 21st century?
Well, Bukharin correctly formulated an objective situation which Communist Party states in the world system have repeatedly found themselves in, which is namely, in a situation where Western imperialism, especially, but also Japanese, has not been defeated at the world level, the Communist Party state will find itself isolated, and this will retard its development, and it will therefore need to find a way in which it can re-enter the world market without losing its sovereignty. Because most countries in the world lost their sovereignty by entering the world market and will not be sovereign as long as they are integrated into the system of Western and Japanese imperialism. But the reason why Bukharin is interesting is because he formulated the sort of policies which China then adopted in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, up until the present day. But China was more successful at implementing them because mainly because of a fluke, because of the Cold War, because the Americans believed that they could flex China against the Soviet Union, which is why they tried to build up China because it was profitable and they thought that they could use them as an ally against the Soviet Union. Whereas the Soviet Union was the only state in the world which was socialist, and therefore, there was no reason to really build it up for the capitalists. It was more profitable to just exploit the colonies or other capitalist countries, even. So I would say the most important thing is that not just Bukharin, but Bukharin was one of the major influences behind China's development. And China is the only country of the last 50 years that has actually escaped third world status and become a middle income country. So that's not something to sneeze at either.
Okay. So, speaking of China, I guess, so in Platypus, we emphasize Lenin pedagogically as an expression of the historical crisis of Marxism, where one can observe that the left is broadly divided between avowedly Leninist and anti-Leninist tendencies. So, hence, for us, 1917 stands as a question regarding whether we can advance that crisis to transform the left today. That is, if we've regressed from 1917, can we regress to 1917 by investigating the legacy of the revisionist dispute in the Second International and its consequences for the possibilities of emancipatory politics. Uh, the People's Republic of China is also a major source of controversy for the left. And I'm wondering if you could treat China as an object lesson, especially post 78 China. What is the significance of China for the left, for communism? What do its various phases mean for Marxism? What can one learn through an investigation of the history of communism in China?
Well, between 1978 and up until 2013, the Communist Party of China moved to the right. And at some times they approximated an almost laissez-faire reading of the world situation and the way the country should develop. And a lot of people assume that this would continue until the Communist Party state itself would disappear and China would just become a regular capitalist country like the United States or Europe or Japan. That hasn't happened because in 2013, Xi Jinping came to power and he very much reasserted the control of the party on capital on behalf of the people. And this is interesting because it put a stop to the predictions that China was sort of going to develop along Western lines, that the Communist Party state was kind of a fluke, and that the natural development of the Chinese economy would lead to it becoming a country like those of the West, basically. And that didn't happen. And Xi Jinping has to be read as the leader of the center left of the Communist Party of China, which is an enormous organization. I mean, it has almost 100 million members, making it the largest political party on the planet. But earlier I mentioned that 1978 is a big turning point in the history of the world system and the Communist Party state, because that's when reform and opening up starts in China. I've described the momentous changes that that brought about. But there's another important year, which is 1987, because that's the year that the Soviet Union began perestroika and glasnost. And it's interesting because the Chinese leadership is very interested in the Gorbachev period because they regard it as the reason for the Soviet Union's collapse. And they have tried to learn that lesson so that they don't go down the same sort of path. Because what Gorbachev did when he came to power is he basically gutted the state-owned industries. He basically allowed the managers of nationalized enterprises to become capitalists. They no longer had to, as they did before, give most of their profits over to the state in the form of taxes, which would be used to subsidize social utilities. They could keep it for themselves, which led to these former managers of nationalized industries becoming capitalists, and they became the oligarchy. And Gorbachev basically ensured that the Soviet Union would just slide straight into a capitalist system, which is what Russia became. Whereas in China, and much to the chagrin of Western propagandists at the time and to this day, that didn't happen. The party state has remained in place and it's kept capital under control.
Okay, well, fascinating.
Oh,
So, the org.
oh, one more thing that I'll add is that one time Dong Sun was interviewed and he said, they asked him, what did your father think of Gorbachev when he met him? And he said, My father said, here is a man who appears to be very intelligent, but is in fact quite stupid because he's trying to have political and economic changes simultaneously. That can only be done under exceptionally rare circumstances. In reality, you need a stable political system to facilitate the economic transformations. Otherwise, you'll have anarchy.
Okay. Fascinating, because this leads to my next question, which is the economic organization of both the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China are sometimes critically labeled as state capitalism, sometimes ambivalently as state socialism, and sometimes affirmatively as actual existing communism. I'd like you to help us navigate these terms and explain the mixed enterprises of these nations, the rationale behind policies like modernization, isolation, and opening up, and the meaning of market socialism. Moreover, I'm curious as to what you make of these politically. How has the economic struggle of these states translated to the political task of the left? How do we measure their successes? That is, by what metric do we judge the character of these purported socialist empires?
Well, there's no such thing as a pure economy in the sense that there has never been, there isn't, and there never will be an economy which is entirely based on private property, or an economy which is entirely based on state-owned enterprises, or an economy that's entirely based on cooperatives. In any real-world economy, you will have different forms of property existing side by side, sometimes in conflict with each other, sometimes harmoniously. The question is which of them predominates, because one form of property will always predominate over the others. In the Soviet Union, that was the state-owned enterprise, because that was the main basis of the whole economy. Whereas in China, you have a much more integrated system of state-owned enterprises, cooperatives, and private enterprises. In China, they have an interesting system because by their sheer size, the state-owned enterprises are able to coordinate the activities of smaller private enterprises. And that allows the market to be slotted into the national plan. Now, I refer to Chenyun as China's Bukharin because he came up with what he called birdcage theory, which is the idea that you allow the market to exist insofar as it develops the productive forces and raises the standard of living. But you also have the state put controls onto capital to prevent it from super exploiting the population and keeping their level of development down. Now, as this relates to the left, I would say that these countries should be supported insofar as they are actually raising people's standard of living, and they should be opposed when they don't. Like, for example, I would say that China's investments in Africa are a mixed bag because there's an ecological disaster quite recently in Zambia as a result of a Chinese mine. That sort of thing has to be condemned. But on the other hand, in Mozambique, the Chinese built massive roads and bridges, which are used by everyone in Mozambique and which benefits everyone. So again, I would say it's case by case. But I think the ultimate criteria for a revolution's success has to be human welfare.
Welfare. Okay, interesting. I might skip these next two questions because it seems like you already answered them. Because, well, I'll read them out loud. Because the next two questions I was going to ask you is one of them was how might the struggle for socialism internationally inform the struggle for socialism in China and vice versa? That was one of the questions. And then the next question I was going to ask was in our previous conversation, you've described Chen Yun as China's Bukharin. And I was going to ask you why. How does Yun remain faithful to Bukharin? What is it that makes Yun's appropriation of Bukharin practices an apparently necessary response to the problems and tasks of 80s and 90s China? So if you want to expand on those points, feel free.
Well, earlier I mentioned that between 1978 and 2013, it seemed like China was moving towards a more laissez-faire direction year on year because state control over capital was being relaxed, labor was being exploited, and so on and so forth. Now, Chen Yun initially supported Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up. It's the sort of thing he'd advocated even under Mao and for which he'd been sidelined. But the interesting thing is that in Deng Xiaoping's later career as the head of the People's Republic of China, Chen Yun became one of his most prominent critics because Chen Yun believed that the market reforms in China had actually gone too far, that government corruption had become quite serious, He even went so far as to say that a lot of the members of the Communist Party have forgotten that they're supposed to be communists, given their lavish lifestyles and their lack of regard for the common people. I think that he would be very pleased to see the turn that has come about since 2013, especially the campaign to clamp down on corruption and to reassert the control of the state-owned enterprises as part of the wider economy, and to rein in property speculation by privateers, and so on and so forth. So I would say one of the differences between Bukharin and Chenyun is Chenyun lived long enough to see the worst aspects of market reform and to criticize them. Whereas in Russia, the market reforms were not allowed to develop to a sufficient extent that these became as obvious before the 5-year plans were instituted to replace them.
Okay, fascinating. So, okay. So I was gonna, okay, so now I'm down to my last final 5 questions. And then once again, after this, then I got the San Antonio contacts here to ask questions, and then after that, we'll open it up for Q&A. So, okay, so this first question is, if you were to attempt to reproduce your education and pedagogy, how would you go about doing it? What do you think are the best resources for learning more about Bukharin, the history of the Soviet Union, China, Deng, etc.? Who should folks be reading? Who are the left's teachers?
So many books and people have influenced me that I couldn't possibly reconstruct myself exactly pedagogically. But I would say that Karl Marx and Emanuel Wallerstein, Samir Amin, and Arrighi and Andre Gunther Frank would be the biggest influences in terms of conceptualizing the world situation. I would also say that War and Peace and Das Kapital are always at the back of my mind when I look at these things. They are my favorite books.
Okay, nice. So also throughout our conversations, you've emphasized the necessity for any communist movement, party, or leader to be pragmatic. So I guess a question that came in my mind is, how does one differentiate between revisionism and pragmatism? Is there a clear-cut distinction between the two?
Well, I don't think there's a clear-cut distinction to the extent that I would say Marxism had many different tenets. And I would say that the methodology, historical materialism, is very much still worth having and still the best way to make sense of these things. And the application of the dialectic, even to the natural sciences, is still worth having. But there are also propositions which were made by classical Marxism, which are so hopelessly out of date that there's no reason for us not to revise the theory. For example, the idea that the more industrialized the country becomes, in other words, the more maturated the capitalist system becomes, the more revolutionary the proletariat would be, and the more immediate would be the prospects of socialism. The opposite has happened. Countries in which capitalism was most developed in terms of industry were the least revolutionary and became the centers of counter-revolution, especially the United States, and before that, Great Britain and France. So I would say Marxism's methodology in terms of the dialectic and historical materialism is very much still worth having, as is much of the analysis of capitalism. But insofar as some of its tenets have become outmoded, we really do need to innovate. I mean, a lot of what Marx and Engels wrote about socialism, for example, turned out to be very different in practice. They talk about doing away with commodity production. And in practice, socialist states have found that to be very difficult to do. Whereas in classical Marxism, the conception was you would very quickly get rid of it. You'd very quickly start trading things based on use value and labor vouchers and so on and so forth. That just was not the case.
Okay. So also, I was gonna say, I think I find it fascinating that you make a delineation between, in some sense, being a leftist and being a communist. Do you think there's a historical precedent in Marxism for, in a sense, abandoning leftism? Daringly, might it be the case that we possibly need to, say, abandon Marxism for the advancement of communism today?
Yes and no. I think that insofar as Marxism puts forward an analysis which is factual and relevant, it should be maintained and elaborated on. But insofar as it puts forth tenets or propositions which are not in line with the facts. It needs to be revised or even abandoned entirely. I think that Marxism is a very important conceptual tool, but it's only one way of getting to socialism. I think there are many different schools that we can learn from. And I think we should learn from all schools of human thought. The world should be our teacher. As for the differentiation between leftists and communists, I mean, I would say if you look at the Communist Party of China, it doesn't really position itself as being on the left. It positions itself as being a communist party, but it doesn't position itself as being on the left. So I would say there is that precedent. But I would also say some people would regard communism as being a part of the left, but I would say that communism is so different from the other tendencies of the left that to group them together is a bit silly.
All right. And so my final question for you is, I'm going to ask you the age-old question thrown at anyone who purports to be, say a leftist or a communist or whatever, which is, what is to be done? What are the communists doing today to achieve their aims? What should the American left and the left in the first world do? What should the left in South Africa do and the left of the global South do?
Well, speaking very generally, and I do mean very generally, because in every country you have to do a bit of a different thing. You need to build a political party, and it needs to not only represent the best interests of the working class, but actually have the support of the majority of that class. And in some countries, it might even be necessary to gain the support of the petty bourgeois so that you have a majority of the citizenry backing your political party. And that will allow you, in legal or illegal means, or both, to actually challenge the existing state hierarchy and to seize and hold on to state power. You also need to unionize and you need to form cooperatives. And above all, you need to integrate all three of these things together so that you have a powerful political force. Powerful exactly because it's a mass force. In the third world, it's to some extent easier, paradoxically as it may sound, because in the third world, government is very weak compared to in the first world. It's much easier to push over than it is in the first world.
All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to open it up to, well, I guess now how we're going to, I guess I'll propose two things. Either what we can do here is, because I know our San Antonio contacts here have pre-drafted questions. If I might actually propose, what we'll do is we'll switch in and out. Where we're going to open this up to a public Q&A where we're going to have first the San Antonio contacts ask questions or like one question, then we'll let someone in the audience ask a question. And yeah, we'll just go back and forth for that until I guess until we pick. Oh, all right. So we're gonna you prefer not. You do okay. You prefer not to. Okay. So we got our first question here from Crichton. You want to say your question?
Okay. This question's a slightly critical one, but I do think it's a important one, at least to explain insofar as we take up China somewhat affirmatively. It can be argued that modern China globally benefits from the system of neoliberalism while not being neoliberal itself, such as, let's say, Iraq post-neoliberal shock treatment, choosing to trade with China due to their economic incentive, or due to the economic incentive that Chinese state companies offer. Do you think that if we agree that China is pursuing socialism, that it will keep the international component of socialism against the neoliberal system, even if they benefit from it? If so, why?
I think China does benefit from the global neoliberal hegemony, but I argue that's because the alternative that most countries have is deal from China or neoliberal shock therapy through the IMF and the like. And if the alternative is that shit, countries like Iraq are going to sell to China. You know? One of the things that China is often criticized for is that the Chinese don't really care about the ideology of the state in question. They'll do business with anyone. So you can be a theocracy like Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia. They'll do business with you. You can be a Marxist-Leninist state like Cuba or Vietnam. They'll do business with you. You can be a Western state like Britain or America, and they'll do business with you. And I think there is a lot to criticize there. I mean, there are some countries that you just shouldn't do business with, you know, like Israel. That's something you should criticize China for, is that China does a lot of business with Israel. But I would argue that it should not be seen as the responsibility of the Communist Party of China to make revolutions for other countries. The Soviet Union did try to do that. The Soviet Union poured lots of money and arms and training into countries all over the world to try and have them make their own revolutions, and often with terrible results, like they didn't really get anywhere. And the Chinese have learned from that, and they've decided not to go that course. I think that there's a tendency on the left to try and obfuscate that the responsibility for reaching socialism in your own country falls on you and not on whoever happens to be the biggest communist party in the world at that particular time. I don't think you should expect the Communist Party of China to really support socialist movements all over the world. I think that the Communist Party of China, as I said, will do business with anyone. So if they support a socialist country, it will be because it benefits them. But they don't really act on the ideological impulse to support other like movements around the world.
Does anyone in does anyone in the audience have a question they want to ask? Okay, Evie, you want to go?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
All right. I wanted to ask, what in your understanding is the relevance of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and especially for Marx and Lenin? Lenin and Marx and Lenin will both emphasize classes over masses. And so why is this? Is it important that the proletariat specifically takes power, or are they a means for the masses taking power? So yeah, and just more broadly, what is the relevance of the proletariat?
Well, firstly, the dictatorship of the proletariat is not a concept that originates with Marx. It originates with earlier socialism in France. Marx simply developed it. Secondly, I would say that he developed it in the context of industrialization in Europe, the side effect of which was the appearance of this new working class, which appeared to be the most revolutionary force, potentially, which could transfer society from a capitalist stage of development to a socialist one. In countries like Russia and China, it became very important to win over the support of peasantry, and that became a central question. Now, Marx and Engels had written about how the dictatorship of the proletariat would need to coexist with the peasantry, because remember, in the countries where Marx and Engels were writing, like Germany, France, United Kingdom, in all three of these countries, the majority of people lived in the countryside. They did not live in the city. So if a dictatorship of the proletariat was formed, it would have to find some way to coexist with the peasantry, because it could not survive being opposed by the majority of the population. The peasantry could cut off the food supply into and out of the city, as often happened, for example, during the Russian Revolution, which is why forceful grain confiscations had to be made to keep the cities from starving, because the peasants found it advantageous to just withhold food from the cities to hike prices. So that sort of thing has to be watched out for. Interestingly, Stalin once told Molotov that we no longer live in a dictatorship of the proletariat, and we don't need to. And that concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat isn't really used much in China anymore. They've more gone for the concept of a people's republic, which is different from a dictatorship of the proletariat. And interestingly, the people's democracies, as they call themselves in Eastern Europe, much the same thing. They didn't call themselves dictatorships of the proletariat. They called themselves people's republic. So it's a fundamentally different thing.
Right. Well, so I guess can I ask a follow-up question?
Go ahead,
Yeah.
Evie.
Yeah, so I mean, you mentioned that for Marx, like the proletariat seems to be the most revolutionary class present, and that sort of sounds like it's like which class can make the revolution. Is there a reason why Marx thought that the proletariat was the most revolutionary, or was it just like, I mean, like that's just how the circumstances came out? Were there objective reasons, perhaps, why the proletariat was supposed to be the most revolutionary class?
Well, interestingly, I mean, in 1848, when Marx and Engels write the Communist Manifesto, they kind of augured a proletarian revolution was imminent across all of Europe. In practice, what happened just after the manifesto left the printers, there were revolutions all over Europe, but they were overwhelmingly dominated by the petit bourgeois. So, that needs to be accounted for. And Marx and Engels went into hibernation for about a decade. They actually cut out of party politics for about a decade, and they spent the 1850s going through the history and reworking their theory as to, why is it that the working class in 1848 flopped so badly? And they began to realize that the working class could be a revolutionary class, but it required socialist organization. In other words, the working class is not inherently revolution. If that were the case, you would have to explain why socialist revolutions have been so rare. I mean, there are so many countries in the world, but there are so few socialist revolutions. The vast majority of working classes all around the world are non-revolutionary.
All right. So, what's it called? I'm going to, yeah. So first, well, I was gonna say first, I'm gonna let you ask the question, Jordan, and then we're gonna give Alan the what's it called chance. So, do you mind if I put the camera on you?
Okay, so you stated before that China became, well, firstly, the Soviet Union did collapse. And you stated that China became nearly laissez-faire, but it was like up to certain like leaders like Xi Jinping to move it further to the left instead of increasingly going to the right. So I guess like my question is like, how do you, like if we're taking revolution or we're taking communism at a snail's pace, how do you make sure that I guess you don't run into setbacks and that you don't end up revising and revising and revising and never actually getting there?
I don't think there's an easy answer to this. I mean, for example, you can go back to the Soviet Union, you can go to the People's Republic of China, you can pick any example you want, and you will find the leaders of the communist parties complaining about bureaucracy and the lack of workers' democracy and so on and so forth. And it's not quite clear how you reconcile running things efficiently with the level of democracy that socialism demands in the workplace. This is a tension to which there is no easy answer. The best answer we can give is that we need to experiment to try and find out what works and what doesn't. I mean, during the Cultural Revolution in China, I would argue there was too much democracy. There's so much of it that every factory was sort of running itself. And since every factory was running itself, there was a lack of coordination between them, which is necessary for the functioning of large-scale industry. And you had exactly the same problem in the Soviet Union, which is why even under Lenin, they had to reintroduce one-man management on the factory floor because the council system proved to be so inefficient. So it's not quite clear, but I would argue that the benchmark should be, are you moving towards, or are you at least maintaining an economic system in which the socialized sector is predominant or not? That should be the benchmark. In China, the socialist system defined as like the state-owned sector of the economy and the cooperative sector was shrinking from 1978 onwards. Whereas from 2013 onwards, since Xi has come to power, it has become more important again. And you see a lot of panic about this in the Western press about like how Xi Jinping is apparently the reincarnation of Mao Zedong, which is very far-fetched, but it shows you they do recognize that there is a turn here that they don't like.
All right, Alan, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I kind of have like a question I was going to ask, and then also to follow up on Evie's question. So my first was use the word private property to describe, I guess, a lot of things. But where do you think labor comes in for Marx? Like, what is labor in bourgeois society? What is the labor principle? And how does this affect the production of capital? And then my second question is you mentioned that Marx, like after 1848, kind of goes into a hibernation. Um, and this reminds me of like, yeah, like Marx is a kind of outside of party politics. Um, but in that time he develops a theory of Bonapartism. And so what is Bonapartism? Is China Bonapartist?
Well, I'll start by saying that if you read Das Kapital, Marx points out that labor means different things depending on the mode of production. But under capitalism, labor is above all a commodity. It can be bought and sold on the market like any other commodity, but it has the distinguishing feature of being the only commodity that can increase value by creating other commodities. That is why wage labor has a use value, which is the profit it can generate for a capitalist, and an exchange value, which is the wage the capitalist pays to the worker. I would say that for Marx, especially, the problem is that he wanted to move society away from the conceptualization of people as things. And under capitalism, a worker becomes just a worker. They're not really a human being. And if you read Das Kapital closely, you'll see that Marx is actually arguing against people like Ricardo and Thomas Malthus, who argued that the natural level of wages would be subsistence. In other words, workers would naturally always be on the brink of starvation, because if capitalists had to pay workers higher wages, then capitalism wouldn't work, the whole system would collapse. You need to starve the working class so that the bourgeoisie can actually turn a profit. And Marx was specifically arguing against that because Marx did not believe that people were just things. And he wanted to move beyond that to a situation where, as he and Engels like to put it, the exploitation of man by man would end, and you would have instead the administration of things by man. As for Bonapartism, I mean, it's come to mean everything for everyone in a way, because people were saying that there were socialists at the time saying that Lenin was just a Bonapartist, that he was Robespierre, and that sort of thing was also said about Deng later on and so forth. I wouldn't say that China is really Bonapartist. I think they have a much more complicated system for which we still lack a sufficient terminology to describe. Because in China, you have different levels of ownership. You have the state-owned enterprises, you have the private corporations, some of which are multinational, some of which are foreign, some of which are local. And you have a huge cooperative movement in China, like a massive cooperative movement in China. I think it employs something like 100 million people, which is more than the population of a lot of countries all around the world. So no, I would say that China is a people's republic, and I would say people's republic is a different form of government. I think China ceased to be a dictatorship of the proletariat just after the Mao era.
Okay, try to mute. Wait, let's see. Are we muted? No. Okay. You want to ask your next question? Okay, and then after that, yeah, Alan, do you want to do a follow-up first, or do you want yeah, or sorry. Do you have a follow-up question, Gretchen? Or sorry, Alan, or
You can ask your question first.
all right.
This is probably going to be my last question, so I don't actually have that many. Aside from China, in what other communist countries do you see Bukharin and Deng's influence? How does it manifest? In what ways are they sort of taken up by these countries?
Well, what is interesting here is that Vietnam was much more in the Soviet camp, if you'd like, than the Chinese camp after the Sino-Soviet split. Despite which, in the 1980s, Vietnam economically began to emulate China rather than the Soviet Union with the Doi Moi reforms. And that's been rather successful in Vietnam. Unlike most third world countries, the standard of living is actually rising substantively in Vietnam. Cuba tried to emulate China in the same way that Vietnam did, but with less success. But that's more because of geography than anything else, because Cuba is right next to the United States. The United States can't tolerate it being successful, because that would be a challenge to its own authority in Latin America, which, as it declares repeatedly, is its backyard. And Vietnam is further away. So ideally, America wouldn't tolerate the Communist Party in Vietnam either. But since the Vietnamese won their independence, they kind of made their peace with them in a way that they really don't want to because the Cubans are much closer to them. North Korea is a bit of a spanner in the works with that idea because North Korea is also pretty far away from the United States, but North Korea is under much more sanction than Vietnam. But I would argue that's because, unlike Vietnam, North Korea has been the slowest to actually reform itself. North Korea has kind of frozen itself very much into like the old Soviet model. They haven't really adopted much in the way of market reforms. They haven't tried to get foreign investment and so on and so forth in the way that Vietnam and Cuba have actually done. So I'd say Bukharin and like reforms have influenced the Soviet Union, Poland, Hungary, China, Vietnam, North Korea, and Cuba, and also Laos to some extent. People forget, but Poland and Hungary were actually having market socialist systems. People think that Eastern Bloc states all had like the Soviet economy. That's not the case.
All right, Alan, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I kind of lost it. Yeah, you mentioned at the beginning when I joined, that like Deng and Bukharin, they were kind of disavowed by the communists because they were kind of falling below their like utopianism.
Mm.
Um, I suppose my question is, on the one hand, it's like y yes, like we should kind of be like tactical or practical, but at the same time, should we lower our expectations when it comes to revolution and socialism?
Well, I would say that Bukharin very much disappoints ultra leftists. And I'd say the same is true of Deng Xiaoping. But I would say that what leftists need to reckon with is the fact that revolutions are actually very rare historically. I mean, if you look at the actual record, the amount of countries where you have had a revolution and an entirely new economic system taking place as a result of, mass action from below, it's actually very small, very small. I mean, we're talking about like maybe 20 countries since the 19th century. I would say that leftists need to reckon with the fact that revolution is only something that you can pull off if you've committed a lot of time and effort to making it. And you have to realize that because they're so rare, you shouldn't just pin all of your hopes on a revolution. Because a lot of people on the left kind of assume, when the revolution comes, we'll work everything out and we just need to sit back and wait for the revolution to happen on its own. No, you need to actually work towards it. It's not so. Stalin used to say revolution is a boat that rows itself to shore. It's not the case. Like Che said, it's an apple that has to be plucked from the tree. Aside from which, I would also say that leftists should grow out of this idea that you should pin all your hopes on revolution. You should find other ways to try and construct socialism as well. Because, I mean, the other thing about revolutions is their success also depends on a lot of factors which you can't really plan for. I mean, the reason the Soviet Union came into existence is the First World War. The Bolsheviks didn't start World War One. That's something that just happened. But they made the best use of a bad situation. So that is something that revolutionists should learn from.
All right, so so Jordan, then Evie.
I guess I was asking, at what point would you say the dictatorship of the proletariat, I guess, ceases to be the dictatorship of the proletariat? And if it does cease to be the dictatorship of the proletariat, do you believe it could still reach communism? Or do you think counter-revolution would be necessary in that case?
Well, Marx and Engels used to argue that the dictatorship of the proletariat would be a sort of transition period of political economy, in the sense that the working class would make a revolution, it would expropriate the expropriators, i.e. capital, and the working class would become the ruling class. And they would make concessions to the peasantry to ensure that the cities would be fed, and they would slowly coax the peasantry towards socialism by example. Marx and Engels wrote that they shouldn't expropriate the peasantry and collectivize agriculture immediately. Marx and Engels were more advocates of you set up model collective farms and you make them successful, and then peasants would gradually be induced to either emulate these farms or to join them. I would say that Marx and Engels believed there would come a point where the dictatorship of the proletariat would become redundant because it would have successfully repressed the landlord class and the capitalist class, and it would kind of merge with the proletariat. And as you develop a stateless, classless, moneyless society, the administrative apparatus, including the dictatorship of the proletariat, will become superfluous. In China, I'd say the reason the dictatorship of the proletariat disappeared is because the government came to represent conflicting sections of class society. So in the Communist Party of China, you have a lot of people who are workers, you have a lot of people who are farmers, and you have business people. So you have these different interests in the political party. And there is a class struggle within the Communist Party of China itself. And the factions of it reflect that. So I would say China ceased to be a dictatorship of the proletariat because it became a people's republic. It tried to balance the competing interests of society.
All right, Evie, go ahead and ask your question.
Right. So you talk about this sort of pragmatic viewpoint that you have, right? And I guess so, like, to maybe give some context for the question I'm asking, like, what, like Marx will talk about how, or I forget if it's Marx, but it was either Marx, Lenin, or maybe it was Lukács actually. I don't remember exactly, but they'll talk about how. Let me just use a different example. Luxemburg in Reformer Revolution will give the viewpoint of Bernstein, which is like the movement is everything, the goal is nothing, right? And
Terrible
insofar as
slogan.
like, sorry,
A terrible slogan.
yeah, but the thing is that phenomenologically, insofar as you don't like insofar as revolution isn't what ought to happen, revolution appears impossible, right? So like I guess my question is just like um what well I'm trying to think how to phrase this like what is desirable from a pragmatic standpoint, and does desirability in a pragmatic sense affect what actually appears possible?
Well, I'll start by answering that question by saying that a lot of people in the Soviet Union, in the People's Republic of China, and elsewhere have used pragmatism as a sort of mask for opportunism. There were people like Gorbachev who were saying that all they wanted to do was reform the socialist system and to de-Stalinize it and to democratize it and this, that, and the other. But in practice, that basically meant destroying the Soviet Union and bringing back capitalism. And that does need to be guarded against, because I mean, I remember the chief ideologue of Gorbachev was a guy called Yakovlev. And he said that their whole shtick was first you delegitimize Stalin by citing Lenin, then you delegitimize Lenin by citing Plekhanov, and then you delegitimize Plekhanov with liberalism. So you slowly roll back the revolutionary project. So that definitely does need to be guarded against, but it does not follow from the fact that some people use pragmatism to mask opportunism, that pragmatism is just an opportunistic grift. I mean, Lenin, for example, was attacked at the time when he instituted the new economic policy. Tens of thousands of cadres tore up their party membership card and said that this isn't what we signed up for. Lenin is a capitalist sellout. you know. But the new economic policy was simply something that had to be done if the economy was to be revived. And it worked. By 1928, the Soviet Union had recovered to pre-war levels of production.
Right. Well, so I guess the way that I mean, like you yourself said that there isn't a strict distinction between pragmatism and opportunism. And like, I mean, when you say pragmatism, like you've talked about the importance of socializing production, but then also the importance of like, for example, raising the standard of living. And these two things may not be identical in all circumstances. So like,
No, that's why you
prag
need to judge case by case.
well, but then the question with pragmatism is like what ultimately is the goal, because it's you boiled things down to a system of ethics, and so you basically just have to delineate what is ethically desirable and what isn't.
Well, I'm not really concerned with ethics. Above all, I'm just interested in what efficiently improves the standard of living. So I would say that there will come
So
a point, I'm quite sure, where you could move into a more comprehensive socialist system while raising the standard of living, but we're not quite there yet. There's a lot more
so
experimentation that has to be done before we can get to that point. I mean, every system has its limitations. Socialism can't do everything. And I think a lot of people on the left don't realize that.
yeah, I mean, I guess as a follow-up, let me just ask, like in the short term, it may be possible to raise the standard of living much more drastically by entering capitalist development. And so, like, by
I
moving
would
away
argue, I would
objectively from
argue that's not
socialism.
the case. Well, I would argue that's not the case because if China had, Milton Friedman went to China twice. I believe in 1980, he went the first time. And he was asked to explain his theory of inflation to the Chinese leadership. Instead of which he chose to tell them that they needed to privatize everything, they needed to abolish all price controls, and so on and so forth. And they laughed in his face, and they didn't do that. If China had done what Milton Friedman told them to do, China would be a basket case like Russia today. It would have looked like 1990s Russia. Because by definition, if you enter the capitalist system and you gear your whole economy towards simply serving the needs of the most advanced countries, Europe, the United States, Japan, you will get the opposite of development in the sense of human well-being. I mean, you can look at the third world, which is most countries in the world. Most people in the world are poor and their lives are getting worse. And that's because their economies are not geared to raising their own standard of living. Their economies are geared first and foremost to providing raw materials and sometimes finished goods to the first world. So it's important to read, for example, Andre Gunther Frank on this, that third world countries are retarded in their development specifically by the mechanism of being integrated with the first world and not having governments strong enough to prevent multinational corporations from the first world from completely exploiting and bringing down the standard of living in these countries. I mean, the Congo would be a very obvious example. The Congo is not exactly overrun with government regulation. The Congo is as laissez-faire as it gets, and I mean, look at it.
Can I
All
just give
right.
one example of what I'm talking about?
Evie,
Yes.
if I might hold you on there for 1 second. So we're coming to the last 10 minutes of this recording. I'm going to send a new link. And then, Evie, I'll let you one more follow-up, but then we have to move on because there's other people in the
Yeah,
room
sure,
who have
sure,
questions.
sure.
All right. Okay. So first, let me send out the the Zoom link. Yeah. Okay. Wait. Give me 1 second. Oh wait. Shoot. I should have paused the recording before I did this. Oh, whatever. Now.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, if I just may give an example, like there's an example in which, like, so for example, social democracy and in the new sort of kind in like the US. So like the New Deal improved the standard of living for many people in the US. But that was patently brought about by FDR in order to thwart the movement of the communist movement in the US. And then on
Despite
the
the
other,
despite which
can
the
I can
Communist
I finish
Party
can I
backed
finish
them.
my question?
Sure, sure.
And then on the other side, you have China, which exploits other countries in order to improve its own standard of living. So, yeah, yeah, right. That's
Well, firstly, I would say that one of the interesting things about American history is that the Communist Party USA backed FDR during the New Deal. And I would say that if there was an opportunity to make a revolution in the United States, that was probably it in the midst of the Great Depression. They chose not to do that. But I mean, even if the Communist Party USA had made a revolution and it came to power, I don't really think it could have done much different than what FDR did, aside from which maybe they would have nationalized some more industry. So I don't really think all that much would have been different. And then would they have been able to hold on to power? I doubt that very much. I mean, even FDR was considered too much for the American bourgeoisie. You had the whole business plot to try and get rid of him. So I don't really think that the Communist Party could have seized power. I think, and if they did, I think they would have done much the same sort of things that FDR did. As for China, I mean, yeah, there are Chinese corporations that exploit other countries. I don't deny that. But at the same time, I would also argue that China's business in much of the wider world benefits those countries a lot more than Western business does. I mean, like even in Mozambique, which is right across the border from where I live, the Chinese have built lots of roads, like I said, that everyone uses. And people in Mozambique will tell you that they have a more favorable opinion of China than people in the US do. So,
All right, great. Sorry. You want to ask your next question?
Well, this is not actually my question. It comes from a person who's not here today, William. Um, can the idea of socialism in one country be congruent with Bukharin's socialism at a snail's pace? That is, can we achieve something akin to a socialist system in a locality while the rest of the world lags behind? Or is that isolated nation destined to fail?
well, I mean, as Bukharin understood it, he thought that since the revolution had failed to spread to Western Europe and the working class there had proved to be ineffectual at carrying out a successful revolution, Bukharin began to advance the idea that the Soviet proletariat's biggest ally was actually the peasantry of Asia and Africa, because they were more revolutionary than the workers of Western Europe, and they stood more of a chance at carrying out successful revolution. And he was borne out by events in China, Korea, Vietnam, post-colonial Africa, and so on and so forth. But again, Bukharin's idea was that the Soviet Union could slowly begin to develop a socialist economy while being isolated internationally as a socialist state, and that they could find ways in which they could integrate themselves with the capitalist countries and in which they could develop themselves very slowly. But Bukharin never believed that the Soviet Union could construct socialism completely cut off from the wider world. He was simply arguing that in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, the Soviet Union would have to try and construct socialism on its own until such time as revolutionary upheavals in other parts of the world would de-isolate the Soviet Union by creating more socialist states. So for Bukharin, socialism in one country was kind of just, this is what we're going to try to do while capitalism has stabilized itself. And then when capitalism goes into crisis again, there'll be more opportunity to de-isolate the Soviet Union.
Does anyone else have? Does, does, does anyone else have any other questions, or would you? I know you had more questions, Jordan, but anyone from the audience? Okay, Evie, go ahead, Evie.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So, um, and I have a question regarding the Marxist method, and this may be, I'm not sure if this is in the way I'm going to phrase this is entirely within your wheelhouse or not. But like So the Marxist you talked about the dialectic and historical materialism as being essentially what is Marxist, and so so Marx gets the dialectic from Hegel, right? And for Hegel, the thing driving the dialectic is the need for freedom, right? So I was just wondering, like, where does the desire for freedom or the necessity of freedom enter at all into the Marxist dialectic? And if you can speak on it, what is the relationship between the Marxist and Hegelian dialectics?
Well, I'd start by saying that Marx would first have come across the dialectic by reading the ancient Greek philosophers, which he wrote his doctoral dissertation on, which is still worth reading. Then later on, he starts reading Hegel. I would say that historical materialism and dialectics are simply like, if you'd like, the backbone of what later came to be called Marxism. It's not all of Marxism. I mean, if you were to list what is Marxism, you'd end up with a very long list, the labor theory of value, relative and surplus value, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. I would say that definitely Marx draws on Hegel, and he respected Hegel very much, although he was also his sternest critic, which is often forgotten because a lot of people in the West call themselves Marxists, kind of inclined towards idealism more than materialism. I would say that freedom is definitely a part of what Marx considered to be the dialectic, but I would also say that in concrete terms, I'm more interested in looking at the facts rather than ethical questions.
Alrighty. Jordan, you want to ask your next question?
It's just a kind of simple question to clarify. I mean, earlier you said that human welfare would be one of, I guess, like the metrics to track to see like if there's actually like a successful I guess push. And so I guess like what I question is how do you even track, I guess, human welfare? Like I guess kind of an abstract form.
Well, again, if you read Das Kapital, you'll see that Marx talks about how you can actually exactly measure human welfare. Because you can look at things like what is the daily caloric intake? You can look at what is the average wage, what is the rate of inflation, so you can concretely see like are people's standard of living rising or falling by factual methods, and you can measure it quite exactly nowadays, more so than you could in the past. I mean, this is the information age. Like I would argue, if you look at the United States, you can say that the standard of living has been falling consistently since the 1970s because real wages have stagnated. And prices and profits have only been going up and up.
All right. Sorry. You want to ask the next question?
All right. Once again, this is coming from William. Were Jay Lovestone and others like him from other countries correct in believing that some countries are simply not ready for revolution?
Yes. As I said, revolution is a extraordinarily rare event if you look at the long record of human history. In the vast majority of countries, if socialism is to be built at all, it would have to be outside of the framework of revolution. Or if revolution is still to be seen as the method, then in the meanwhile, socialist groups will have to engage in things like electoralism and trade unions and cooperatives. And they will need to engage in perhaps decades of preparation work for a potential revolution. But I think any sort of socialism which kind of hinges all of its hopes on a revolution is doomed to fail.
All right. We got to follow up to that. There we go. Do this one.
Why do you think some older socialists and communists end up turning on their comrades, going over to the West either as government assets or just grifter pedagogues? Is it pure opportunism and self-service, or is there something else at play?
Do you mind if I expand on that question? Because I know the context of that question is Jay Lovestone, right? The American Bukharinist. He, correct me if I'm wrong, he later became a CIA agent, right?
Yeah. His
Right,
papers are
right.
at the
So,
Hoover Institute.
sorry, say that again?
His papers are kept at the Hoover Institute.
Right, right, yeah. And I guess just a generally expanding on that question, right? It's kind of interesting to note that a lot of, or it's kind of interesting to note that it seems that some of our quote unquote best conservatives or whatnot have all come from former disillusioned leftists. There was, I'm
The
forgetting his name, the
Revisions.
guy who split with James Buchanan, the guy I believe his name was Shachtman, who was a former Trotskyist, who later
Hmm.
also became a CIA agent. There was Burnham also. Let's see, going even before that, there was, Mussolini was part of the Italian Socialist Democratic, or yeah, Italian Socialist Party before he was a fascist. There was Dostoevsky, who was a utopian socialist before he became a Slavophile. So yeah, with William's question of, you want to repeat William's question, or you got it?
Yeah, I got it. Why do you think some older socialists and communists end up turning on their comrades, going over to the West either as government assets or just grifter pedagogues? Is it pure opportunism and self-service, or is there something else at play?
Well, sometimes it's money, sometimes it's fame. But I would say that if you take a concrete case like George Orwell created not one but two lists of leftists that he handed over to the Ministry of Information in the United Kingdom, which was working with the security state too. And interestingly, the names on the second list have never been published because Orwell's family is actually trying to prevent them from being published. So you can imagine how damaging it would be. But I mean, if you look at his first list, he lists people like Isaac Deutscher, who's a Trotskyist historian. He writes under his name Jewish agitator. You know, he writes Paul Robeson, black agitator, anti-white. Things like that. I think with people like George Orwell, it's because they started off with this idea of socialism as just that, an ideal, what I call Virgin Mary socialism. They think that socialism is something that has to come into the world immaculately. Otherwise, it will be tainted by original sin until the end of days, and there will be no redemption. So when the Russian Revolution happens, Orwell is disgusted because, oh my God, you have a violent revolution. And he's horrified by the violence in Spain as well. But I'm like, as Engels said, have these gentlemen ever seen a revolution? No. Revolution is an inherently violent process. Marx argues that the level of violence of a revolution will depend on what he calls the historical moral development of society. It will never be the same in any country. I would also add that people like Roy Medvedev began to criticize the Stalin era Soviet Union, but they were also critical of the later Soviet Union. But they remained socialists. Like Roy Medvedev remained a socialist right up until his later years. Whereas someone like Sakharov, who started off as a kind of reformed socialist, kind of gave up on the concept of socialism altogether. But I'd argue with Sakharov, it was a bit different because Sakharov sort of turned on the Soviet system because it was advocating things like Lysenkoism. And to a scientist, the concept of Lysenkoism was obviously ridiculous, and the system that generated it, there must be something very wrong with it. So money and fame would be the two big motives, but then there's also Sakharov's professional considerations. And with people like Solzhenitsyn, it's more the sense that to him, the Soviet Union was kind of the repudiation of, the Slavic genius and all that was holy, that was Russia, and it was this gross internationalist project, and it was atheistic, and so on and so forth.
Evie?
Right. I'm trying to think how to phrase this question. I guess my question is, why isn't there currently a viable movement in more or less advanced countries for socialism or communism? I mean, is it an objective question? Is it a subjective question? Um, Yeah, I might have a follow-up.
I'd start by saying it's rather paradoxical that communism, from its origins in 19th century, communism turned into a state building project in the 20th century. And it became a third world thing, like communism. I mean, there was a powerful communist party in France and in Italy, and to a lesser extent, there were powerful communist parties in Britain and the United States. But in none of these countries did it succeed in taking, let alone holding on to power for any long period of time. Whereas in Russia and China and so on and so forth, it did. So I would start by saying that communist parties came to power where life was absolutely miserable. And that's why a revolution appealed, because, you have nothing to lose but your chains. Whereas even in the late 19th century, when Engels was writing a preface to his 1840s book, Condition of the Working Class in England, he was saying that, 20% of the working class in England are paid such high wages that they're basically bourgeois in terms of their standard of living. And they happen to be the section of the working class that the rest of the working class takes its lead from. And that's why in England, the working class was non-revolutionary. And you have the same problem in the First World generally, that while living conditions have declined in the First World in some ways, they're still high enough that people don't really have a reason to want to make a revolution. And on top of which, there isn't really enough organization of such discontent, even if it were to exist, to seize and hold on to state power.
So, just to sort of summarize what I think, I mean, it sounds like you're articulating part of the Marxist theory of like the labor aristocracy, and so like, I guess my question is just like, are you saying that like revolution isn't possible in more or less advanced countries because the high living standards effectively make it so that there's permanently the whole of the country is something like a labor aristocracy?
Sometimes I'm tempted to say yes, revolution is impossible in the First World, but then I catch myself and I correct myself by saying it's unlikely because, the past is fully predetermined, but the future is open-ended, so things could change. But on the basis of what we have seen, I would say revolution is very unlikely in the First World. If it is to happen, I think standards of living would have to decline very substantively in the First World. And that what would cause that, I mean, if third world countries really became independent in the sense that they no longer allowed themselves to be exploited by the First World, the First World's living standards would go down. And then you might see a revolution in the First World. But I don't think that the First World on its own is a very likely place for revolution. I think the prospects for revolution in the First World lie with the Third World.
So one last follow-up. It sounds like you're sort of articulating an objective, like it's an objective problem of well, the objective conditions aren't right for the working class to want to revolt, rather than a subjective problem of consciousness. And so I guess my question is, how is that different from accelerationism?
Well, it's different in the sense that I'm not really advocating for things to get worse for working class people in the Third World. I mean, I kind of just take things as they come, you know. I don't really articulate what I think should happen to the First World, other than I would say that I think it's quite possible for First World countries to actually have free and fair deals with Third World countries and for these countries to complement each other and for their standards of living to rise together. I don't think the First World has to be imperialist forever, and I don't think the Third World has to be imperialized forever. I think these dynamics can change, but I don't claim to know what the world system will look like 100 years from now.
Yeah, we got some comments in the chat. Do the folks in the chat want to voice their questions?
Oh, it was just me. I mean, I didn't think that these were maybe um worth having full-fledged questions. I guess just with the question about why do so many ex-socialists end up um going to the totally opposite end of the spectrum. I think a trend that I have noticed is that a lot of people end up throwing out the baby with the bathwater, um, instead of maybe coming away with a more complex idea of socialism. Like I was thinking back to Hertz and how he had a period of his life, especially after living in Europe for a while, where he kind of decided that okay, yeah, it doesn't look like socialism is possible in Europe, but in Russia, because of or particular character, um, he thought that it was possible, and it kind of took some Slavophile tones, but he still stayed a socialist, unlike someone like Dostoevsky. Um, and I was thinking of also maybe someone like Finkelstein, who he's no longer a Maoist, but that kind of thinking is still kind of prevalent in his in the positions he has now. There's still some you can kind of see that latently, and that's something that you and I have discussed. Um, and yeah, I didn't think that it was really worth having a question on. It was just kind of a comment that I thought maybe was just worth for the comments, but not for a question. I don't know if you want to say anything on that.
Well, I'll start by saying I've always wondered why Eldridge Cleaver went from being a Black Panther to a Republican. That's always fascinated me, and I have no idea how that happened. But I will say that I think Herzen was more perspective than a lot of Marxists were at that time as to socialism's feasibility in Russia being higher than that of Europe. A lot of Marxists were kind of blind to that. They kind of assumed that Europe would take the lead in world socialism, and that turned out not to be the case.
If I might
I would
push the question,
I would also just add that I think Finkelstein doesn't realize how much of his Maoist phase he's never unlearned. If you read between the lines of his arguments, the Maoism is still there.
yeah, if I might push this discussion point even further, I think, well, I'll make this a comment and then I'll frame it as a question, which is, so, Rosa Luxemburg has this observation in Reform or Revolution where she makes a note that it seems that as you grow the Marxist or as you grow a Marxist movement, you also grow the petty bourgeois tendency that is revisionism. Because as she observed with the emergence of revisionism, the emergence of opportunism within the Second International, he notes that this emerges with the success and victory of the Second International. So it seems, and also it seems like later on, right, with the 1940s, right, when you have the Nazis or the quote unquote National Socialists, right, it seems that as you build up the forces of revolution, you also build up the forces for counter revolution, right? So, because as you have a much more revolution, or as you have a much more stronger left, you also have to build up a right that also comes from the left, right? So I guess framing this as a question is, as you have, or I guess framing this as a question is, could it really be, or could we really reduce, in some sense, opportunist, revisionist, or in some sense, those on the right to just merely as they capitulated to Western imperialism because of money or because of fame or because of Western ideology, or is there something more serious going on here where it seems where the growth of Marxism or the success, or in some sense the successes of the left also in some sense brings about its own monster? Do we create our own monster?
Well, I would start by saying it's a basic law of the universe that there's no cause without effect or an effect without a cause. So obviously, when you have a left appearing and becoming more prominent, there'll be a right-wing reaction to it, and vice versa. I would say that it's not a coincidence that the Second International was dominated by European parties and then went in for an imperialist war. It shows you that capitalism in Europe had developed a working class which was more likely to fall in with its own bourgeoisie than it was to fall in with workers in other countries. I mean, if I remember correctly, the Second International had like a Japanese party in it, and that was about it as far as non-European parties were concerned. And I think they had like a few American representatives as well. In the 1940s, I mean, you can sort of gauge the level at which people at that time and place perceived socialist revolution to be imminent by how much the right wing kind of tries to capitalize on socialism's appeal. Like, Hitler declaring his movement the National Socialists, would be a prime example of that. Socialism was so popular that even the right wing had to kind of capitalize on it, if you'd like.
Evie?
Yeah, I'm following up a little bit on my last question. I guess if like living standards would have to get worse in the first world if it's sort of an objective problem. Why if I don't plan on moving to like a third world country and doing politics there, why should I be a socialist today?
Well, I would start by saying that I think that socialism would materially benefit first world people, but perhaps not immediately. It might in the immediate lead to reduction of their living standard because they can no longer exploit the working class in the third world. Then again, you could find ways in which you could develop relations between what are now first world and third world countries so that they complement each other and they actually raise each other's standard of living, which is not exploitative. It's a basic proposition of the most honest capitalists that countries have to exploit other countries, that there's no way of getting around that, but that's not the case. And I would also say that, I mean, if you look at the United Kingdom, when the Labour Party was still properly socialist between 1900 and the 1970s, I mean, working class people had it pretty good. I mean, there was subsidized housing, very low rate of homelessness compared to now. Employment rate was much higher, wages were higher, and so on and so forth. So there are all sorts of benefits that working class people in the first world even can derive from actually advancing a socialist project.
All right. But Evie, I'll give you one follow-up and then
Yeah. So what you've said here is something kind of peculiar, which is that revolution is unlikely in the first world, but then also like by advancing the socialist project, the first world countries have something material to gain from it. So like I guess it sort of sounds like you're almost cleaving off revolution from the reforms of a potentially socialist project.
Well, I mean, I don't think you would have gotten the Labour governments in the United Kingdom, especially the 1945 Attlee government, is the most radical of them all. You wouldn't have gotten that without there having been 2 world wars and the working class in Britain just saying, enough, we're going to demand our full rights now. We're not going to allow these aristocrats and capitalists to dominate the show the way they used to. And I don't think without India leaving the British Empire, you would have had that sort of wake-up call in the United Kingdom where the working class did actually assert itself and actually did become the government and actually did nationalize industry and actually did create things like the NHS, public education, and so on and so forth. So that wouldn't have happened without external prompts. And the same is true of the Russian Revolution. Like I mentioned, the Bolsheviks would never have come to power if it wasn't for the shock of the First World War. I mean, Germany destroyed Russia. Like it completely wrecked Russia. Japanese imperialism completely wrecked China as well. And that provided the opening for revolutionary movements. And it was the success of these revolutionary movements that made reformism viable in the First World. I mean, the reason why Scandinavian social democracy became a thing is they were looking at the Soviet Union. They were saying, look, we need to give our workers a better deal or we're going to end up with more Soviet unions. So that's what they did. And West Germany, it's the same thing. East Germany was right next door. So they needed to create some sort of welfare state that would actually give their workers a good deal so that they don't go over to the communists. And like we mentioned earlier, the New Deal was the exact same thing. So reformism very much hinges for its viability on the threat of revolution, real or perceived, merely perceived. I mean, in the United States, for example, I don't think that the prospect for revolution was very serious even during the Great Depression, mainly because the communists didn't really make use of the opportunity. But aside from which, I mean, even later, the civil rights movement, the way liberals tell it is kind of that you had MLK and he was a pacifist and they did peaceful protest and blah, blah, blah. And then magically segregation was ended. But they kind of ignore that there was also the open threat of violence represented by people like Malcolm X. And it was the threat of violence and the need to avoid violence that compelled the government to actually give in to the so-called pacifist section of the civil rights movement.
All right.
I'm not sure if you ever answered my original question.
Well, wait. I was gonna say, so we're down to the last 6 minutes of this meeting. So what does it say? Evie, I'll let you one more follow-up. Yeah, and then what's it called? Then we'll have to do the questions here in this room, and then we'll open it up to the floor if anyone else has any questions. So I'm gonna end this meeting and wait.
Well, it's not exactly a follow-up. It's just me asking my original question, which was, why should I be a communist if it's unlikely that revolution, like the objective conditions are going to be right for revolution in my country? Why should I be a socialist in the first place? Like, how will it actually contribute to the revolution or even reforms for me to be a socialist in the US right now?
Well, I think socialism can in some ways improve the living standards of the working class in any number of countries, including the first world. But I don't think that the prospects for socialism internationally really hinges on how many socialists there are in the first world. So I don't really think that how many socialists there are in the first world is an important question.
Okay, thanks.
All right, Jordan. Okay, sure. Jordan, you have a question. Let me turn the camera to you.
Sure. So I guess going back to the idea of reaching communism at a snail's pace, I guess like the idea is like with that in mind, then the government and society could potentially pass through many lives and generations. And so it seems like at points like you would need a very strong state, like how you said, to do like that bird caging to make sure like capitalism doesn't go crazy and kind of take over. But and like maintain the stability of the socialist characteristics. But like couldn't it eventually just become culturally normative to like kind of be heavily reliant on a state? Like so like how do you have, I guess, the people across generations like still have the will to actually push toward communism?
Well, that's a question that future generations of socialists will have to answer. I mean, it could be that 100 years from now, socialists kind of decide that the birdcage theory is, the be all end all, and they kind of stop. Or they could find ways to like get rid of the state and run everything through a supercomputer, or they could run everything through councils. I don't really claim to know what socialism will look like 100 years from now. I think that, like everything else, it will be contingent on time and place.
If I might follow up on Jordan's question, I think what Jordan's asking is because, what's it called? In Marxism, there's both there's both objective conditions, but there's also the question of the subject, right? And the question of right. I mean, of course, the question of the subject is, the question of like the party, right? What is the party? The party is supposed to be the what is the party? What is the party? The party is supposed to be the conscious agent of the working class, or it's supposed to represent the historical consciousness of the working class. You have the dictatorship of the proletariat. The dictatorship of the proletariat, in some sense, is supposed to be the subjective factor, the subjective political factor of revolution, right? So I think expanding upon Jordan's question, I think when Jordan's asking this question about generations upon generations of communists, the question is because in some sense you can't have like AI institute communism. Why can't you have AI institute communism? Because communism isn't just about objective conditions. Communism is also about the subject. It's also about subjectivity. It's also about in some sense it's this question of freedom, right? It's this question of, self-legislation, right? So I guess to expand on Jordan's question is, if you have generations that become comfortable in some sense of like statism or, in some sense, dictatorship of the proletariat for 1,000 years, right? Or the dictatorship of the proletariat for a millennium or whatnot, is how do you act or like how do you preserve the subjective factor of history or whatnot? How do you make sure that it doesn't just, in some sense, disintegrate into just a affirmation of itself?
This is a question that we haven't really had a good answer to thus far, because if you look at the Soviet sphere, right, in all of these countries, you had a right-wing clique within the Communist Party align itself with the most reactionary forces to destroy the nationalized system and the centrally planned economy. And they were not resisted. Like, the majority of people in the Soviet Union did not want the Soviet Union to be disbanded, but it was disbanded anyway. And you have to ask yourself, why didn't the people resist that? In 1917, Russia had the most revolutionary working class on earth. In 1991, it had one of the most docile. So I would argue that one of the problems was a lack of political education, I'm tempted to say. I think that the masses had become so used to the state taking care of them that they lacked any sort of agency or independent will of their own. I mean, even as like the Yeltsinite coup was going on, you had like the local army officials waiting for like the call from Moscow to stop the coup. They wouldn't do it on their own because they were not used to thinking on their own. The state told them what to do, and they were kind of used to doing what the state told them to do. So there's that problem. But then, I mean, in China, when they tried handing everything over to the masses and telling them to like fix the party, to bomb the headquarters, you had absolute anarchy. So the best thing I could say is that you need to find ways in which you can integrate the people into decision making so that they feel represented and they feel as if their lives are getting better. But you need to balance it, because often the more you democratize something, the less efficient it becomes by virtue of more and more people's decision inputs and so on and so forth. So you need to find that balance between democratization and efficiency. And I would argue that the school system needs to educate people better. I think that social science needs to be a subject in school. And I think it should incorporate history, sociology, anthropology, psychology, and economics, maybe even law. And finally, I would say that we should go back to Lenin's idea that you have an 8-hour workday, but then you have another hour in which everyone in the workplace has to have compulsory political education.
All right. Crichton, you have a question?
Well, this is the last one from William. I actually do think I have a question of my own, but
you can follow it up.
So William's final question is, pragmatism as an approach to socialism, but really end goal, can often be seen to take steps away from said goal in service of building the proper conditions for its achievement. How do we determine to what extent it is acceptable to evolve or betray certain ideals in service of future success? Does it just come down to the ends justify the means, or is there lines that should not be crossed?
Well, I mean, I don't think that third world liberation requires the extermination of first world consumers, because then you would end imperialism, What I would say is that you need to look at the general tendency, or what Podel called la longue durée, the long duration. So in the Soviet Union, during the new economic policy at the time, a lot of people were saying, but the revolution is dead. Capitalism has been restored. You have mass unemployment. You have inflation, and you have this, that, and the other. But then what happens? 5-year plan. Everything turns around. You have full employment, prices are stabilizing, and so on and so forth. So I think you need to look in the long term. You need to look in the long term, and you need to ask which form of property predominates. And in the Soviet Union, under Stalin, it would be state-owned enterprises, whereas during the new economic policy, We had a much more mixed system, and I would argue that during the new economic policy, private farming was actually the most important thing in the country.
Brighton has a follow-up, so
this one is, I guess, it's probably going to be the most milquetoast one, but I do think it's fascinating, at least for me. If we take up the CCP affirmatively, how do you think it can be improved right now? In other words, in which ways is it sort of, I guess, failing for you? In which ways could it be better?
It should make it illegal for Chinese companies to do business with Israel. That would be one thing. And they shouldn't be doing business with the Taliban either. Things like that. I think there are examples of the Chinese doing very shady business that the government really shouldn't allow.
all right. Besides anyone in San Antonio and besides Evie, and once again, thank you all for your contribution. Does anyone else in the audience have any questions? Or Marco, would you like to give your closing remarks if no one else has any questions?
We can take one more question.
Yeah. So one more question from the audience from someone who's not in San Antonio, or sorry, who's not in this room with me, or Evie, just to give a little bit more voices in the room. Yeah, we'll wait a minute, or yeah, and then afterwards, yeah, can give closing remarks if you wish, Marco.
Well, I can add what I wanted to say earlier about people talked about Czechoslovakia as an example of market socialism. Well, they kind of tried to go in that direction, but the Soviet Union stopped them, and the Soviet Union forced them to readopt the Soviet-style system of nationalization of almost everything, essentially planned economy. So, because the Soviets argued that what was called market socialism and socialism with a human face in Czechoslovakia was really a cover for capitalist restoration. That's why they overthrew Dubček. And interestingly, Dubček went to university with Gorbachev, and they used to watch films together.
Out of curiosity, I think we have talked about this, but like a long time ago. But what do you think about that intervention?
I don't think it was necessary. I don't think that there was any risk of Czechoslovakia joining the Western Bloc, which was Brezhnev's sphere. And I don't think that there was really a risk of, if Czechoslovakia becomes more independent, then the rest of the Eastern Bloc will disintegrate, which was Brezhnev's fear. Brezhnev argued that if one country was allowed to go its own way, then they all would, and that would imperil the socialist project worldwide. You know, the so-called Brezhnev doctrine that the Soviet Union had to intervene to keep these countries what they called monolithic. But yeah, I don't think that the Czechoslovak intervention was necessary.
Alrighty, would you like to give closing remarks, Marco? Oh, wait, sorry. Christian asked a question. So Christian's question was, or I guess this will be the last question. Christian's question was, so yeah, or sorry, if you don't mind, Christian, I'm just going to read your question verbatim. So yeah, so Christian says, I don't have a mic, but can someone ask for a follow-up on the point of China should ban business with Israel? How is that an improvement for China?
Well, that's the thing. China is trying to have it both ways. China does business with Israel, which reinforces Israel, but at the same time, you know, China provided a forum in which Hamas and Fatah were able to come to unify, create one bloc with which to oppose Israel. And I think that you can't have it both ways. You can't be supporting Israel economically and then also supporting like the Palestinian movements that are fighting against it. You know, it doesn't really make sense. Unless you want to argue that the Chinese state and Chinese capitalists have conflicting interests, which is possible.
Alrighty, would you like to give your closing remarks, Marco? Yeah.
I think in general, the important thing to consider is that every country is now basically a province of the world state. if you'd like. And you need to think of things in terms of the world economy that all countries are now a part of. Bukharin used to say that the industrialized countries are the cities and the agricultural countries are the countryside, and you have one big country. I think you need to think of it in those terms, but then simultaneously you need to recognize that socialism, like capitalism, will look differently depending on what country it's being implemented in.
Alrighty, well, thank you so much, Marco, for your teaching. I guess everyone here, you want to give a round of applause?
No.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I guess so Platypus San Antonio, we have reading groups every Sunday. Yeah, we